At 47 minutes past 3 in the morning, Riyadh time, a twin-engine cargo aircraft touched down at King Khalid International Airport carrying 11 sealed crates and a team of 9 men whose passports identified them as agricultural inspectors from a country that has not exported agriculture in 3 years. The crates contained no agricultural equipment. The men were not inspectors, and the country they came from is currently fighting a war for its own survival 2,500 miles to the north. For 9 months, every analyst, every defense ministry, every intelligence service tracking the Strait of Hormuz crisis operated under one unspoken assumption. The confrontation between Tehran and Washington would be resolved by the actors who had created it. The United States Navy, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, and the shadow influence of Beijing and Moscow. These were the chess pieces. These were the hands moving them. Everyone else was a spectator. That assumption no longer holds. It has not held for 72 hours. And the full weight of what just happened has not yet landed on a single capital that thought it understood this crisis. Ukraine has entered the Strait of Hormuz, not diplomatically, not symbolically, operationally, with hardware, with personnel, with classified electronic warfare systems that were never supposed to leave Ukrainian soil, and with a kind of expertise that no other nation on earth currently possesses at this scale. And the country that invited them in is the same country that, 18 months ago, refused to even condemn the Russian invasion of their territory. Read those words again. The Gulf monarchies, who spent the entire first year of the Ukraine war hedging between Moscow and Kyiv, who blocked oil production increases that would have hurt Russian revenue, who hosted Russian oligarchs in their banking sectors while Western nations imposed sanctions, have now opened their airspace, their bases, and their command structures to Ukrainian military specialists. The reversal is not partial. It is structural, and it happened in a window so narrow that most Western capitals are still operating on intelligence assessments written before the change occurred. The men who arrived in Riyadh are veterans of the Black Sea drone campaign. The same operators who sank the Moskva, the same engineers who turned the Black Sea Fleet into a museum exhibit by deploying naval drones built in basements and welded together in machine shops outside Odessa. They are now in the Persian Gulf. They are advising the Royal Saudi Naval Forces. They are reconfiguring air defense doctrine in real time. And what they brought with them in those 11 crates is the one technology that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has no answer for. Stay with this analysis carefully because what just unfolded across the Gulf is not a footnote in the broader confrontation. It is the moment the entire architecture of the crisis changed hands without a single missile being fired. The arithmetic that Tehran was running, the calculations that Washington was making, the patient strategic patience that Beijing was practicing, all of it was built on a model of the conflict that no longer corresponds to the situation on the ground. To understand why this development is catastrophically significant, the situation that preceded it must be reconstructed with precision. For 9 months, Iran's leverage in the Strait of Hormuz was not its navy. It was not its Kilo-class submarines. It was not even its anti-ship ballistic missile inventory, impressive as that inventory had become. Iran's leverage was a single, devastatingly effective category of weapon, the Shahed series loitering munition and its naval variants. Cheap, expendable, autonomous, and produced at a scale that no Gulf air defense network had been designed to absorb. The mathematics were brutal. A Patriot interceptor missile costs approximately $4 million. A THAAD interceptor cost roughly $12 million. The Saudi Air Defense Network, comprehensive as it appeared on briefing slides, was built around a finite inventory of these interceptors. Iran could produce a Shahed 136 for somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000. The cost ratio was not just unfavorable, it was structurally unsustainable. Every interceptor fired emptied a magazine that took months to replenish. Every drone that got through demonstrated that the magazine was finite. The Iranians did not need to win individual engagements. They needed only to continue the engagements until the magazines emptied. This was the trap. And every Gulf capital understood the trap. Abu Dhabi understood it. Riyadh understood it. Doha understood it. Manama understood it most acutely of all, hosting the 5th Fleet within drone range of Iranian launch positions. The American carrier strike groups in the region understood it as well, which is why their patrol patterns had been quietly modified for 6 months in ways that defense reporters had not been able to confirm, but that satellite imagery analysts had begun documenting with increasing concern. The situation produced what military planners call a coercion equilibrium. Iran could not actually close the strait. The Americans would respond with overwhelming force if it tried. But Iran could threaten to close the strait persistently, indefinitely, and at low cost, while the cost of maintaining the defensive posture against that threat was depleting Western and Gulf magazines at a rate that no production line could match. The longer the standoff continued, the more leverage shifted toward Tehran. Time in this configuration was not neutral. Time was an Iranian asset. This is the part that nobody in Washington wanted to acknowledge publicly, because acknowledging it would have triggered exactly the kind of escalatory pressure that the administration was trying to avoid. The Carrier Task Force commander knew it. The Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid knew it. The Saudi Air Defense Forces Command knew it. And in Tehran, the men who had designed this asymmetric posture knew that they had constructed the most elegant strategic trap in the modern history of Persian Gulf confrontation. Patience would deliver them everything that aggression could not. And then, in 72 hours, the trap inverted on its architects. Because what arrived in Riyadh on that twin-engine cargo aircraft was not interceptors. It was not more Patriot batteries. It was not another carrier group. It was the one thing the entire Iranian asymmetric posture had no countermeasure for. It was the Ukrainian electronic warfare doctrine refined under Russian fire for 3 years that has demonstrated the capacity to defeat Shahed drones at scale, at low cost, and across enormous geographic frontages. Now consider what this means across every domain where this crisis is being measured simultaneously. Because the implications are not contained to the immediate tactical question of Gulf air defense. They extend catastrophically across the diplomatic architecture, the energy markets, the alliance structures, and the strategic calculations of every capital that thought it had read this situation correctly. The Ukrainian electronic warfare apparatus that has been quietly transferred to Saudi territory is not a single system. It is a layered, integrated, and combat-proven framework that combines high-power microwave emitters, GPS spoofing infrastructure, signals interception platforms, and the most sophisticated drone detection radar mesh currently deployed anywhere on the planet. The Ukrainian armed forces did not develop this architecture in laboratories. They developed it under sustained Russian drone bombardment, with iteration cycles measured in days rather than years, against the same Shahed 136 platform that Iran is now operating in identical configuration. The Iranians provided the Russians with the drones. The Russians used those drones against Ukrainian cities. The Ukrainians built the technology that defeats those drones. And now that technology has arrived in the country that buys most of Iran's neighbors' oil, sits across the Gulf from Iran's primary launch sites, and shares an intelligence framework with the United States Fifth Fleet. The circle has closed in a way that nobody in Tehran's Strategic Planning Directorate anticipated, because nobody in Tehran's Strategic Planning Directorate believed the Ukrainians would ever be invited to close it. The personalities driving this reversal must be named, because the institutional language obscures the human decisions that produce this outcome. Mohammed bin Salman did not consult his foreign ministry before authorizing the Ukrainian deployment. The decision was made in a small circle that included his brother Khalid, the Deputy Minister of Defense, and a senior intelligence official whose portfolio covers the GCC's quiet outreach to Kyiv that has been underway for 14 months. The Saudi Crown Prince has spent 2 years calculating the long-term reliability of American security guarantees and the long-term trajectory of Russian power. He concluded both calculations in the same week. American guarantees require American magazines that are emptying. Russian power is degrading at a rate that makes continued hedging strategically irrational. Ukraine for the first time became more useful to Riyadh than Moscow. In Kyiv, the decision to deploy these specialists was made by Volodymyr personally, against significant internal opposition from commanders who argued that every electronic warfare specialist was needed at the front. He overruled them. The reasoning he provided to his Security Council, according to multiple individuals briefed on the meeting, was that the Gulf deployment would generate 3 concrete returns that no battlefield engagement could produce. It would secure Saudi financial commitments that were beginning to drift back toward Moscow. It would demonstrate to skeptical European capitals that Ukrainian capabilities had reached a level of sophistication that justified continued Tier 1 weapons transfers. And it would, by demonstrating Iranian drone vulnerability in a theater that mattered to American voters, indirectly strengthen the case for continued American support of Ukrainian operations against Russia. The mechanism that connects these dots is the apparatus that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps cannot see clearly because it operates outside the conceptual framework that Iranian strategic planning has used for 40 years. Tehran has always assumed that the Persian Gulf would be a contained theater. Local actors, local dynamics, local consequences. That assumption was reasonable for 4 decades. It is now structurally obsolete. The Gulf has been linked to the Black Sea by a transmission line that runs through drone technology, electronic warfare doctrine, and the personal calculations of 3 leaders who have decided that their fates are now connected in ways that the formal diplomatic architecture has not yet acknowledged. And here is the detail that has not been properly absorbed by any capital outside the immediate operational circle. The Ukrainian deployment is not defensive only. The same specialists who defeat incoming drones are the specialists who launch outgoing drones. The same expertise that builds detection meshes builds penetration profiles. The Ukrainian armed forces have spent 3 years developing not just the doctrine to defeat the Shahed, but the doctrine to use Shahed-equivalent platforms against hardened targets, layered air defense networks, and command and control infrastructure. If that doctrine is now available to Saudi Arabia, and through Saudi Arabia to the broader American command structure in the region, the offensive calculus against Iranian targets has changed irreversibly. The Iranian air defense network, already strained by the requirements of defending against potential Israeli strikes, would now face a fundamentally different threat profile. Loitering munitions launched from Saudi territory, configured by operators who have spent 3 years optimizing them against Russian air defenses that are at least as capable as anything Iran fields, would arrive in Iranian airspace with detection profiles, attack vectors, and target discrimination capabilities that Tehran's current defensive architecture was never designed to absorb. This is the part that the official statements coming out of every relevant capital are carefully not addressing, because addressing it would constitute escalation. The Saudis have said the Ukrainian presence is purely advisory. Kyiv has said the deployment is consistent with broader cooperation initiatives. Washington has said nothing on the record. Tehran has accused the Saudis of provocations without specifying which provocations. And in the empty space between those careful statements, the actual transfer of capability is being completed. The complications that prevent simple resolution begin with the internal dynamics of every actor in this configuration. Iran is not a unified strategic decision-maker. It has not been one for at least 18 months. President Pezeshkian's faction in the executive branch is pursuing one strategy. The IRGC's senior command is pursuing a different and partially incompatible strategy. The Supreme Leader's office is attempting to mediate between them, but with declining authority that has produced visible institutional dysfunction. Within this fractured architecture, the Ukrainian deployment to Saudi territory will be interpreted differently by each faction, and the response will reflect that fragmentation rather than any unified national strategy. The IRGC commanders who built the asymmetric drone posture will demand demonstrative response. Their entire strategic doctrine has been undermined in a single news cycle. Inaction will be read as weakness, both internally and externally. They will press for accelerated drone production, for new launch sites positioned closer to Saudi territory, and for the deployment of new countermeasures designed to defeat the Ukrainian electronic warfare framework. Whether these countermeasures actually exist, or whether they are operational capabilities or aspirational requirements, is a question that Tehran's senior decision-making circle does not yet have a confirmed answer to. The civilian government will resist this escalation, not from pacifism, but from arithmetic. The Iranian economy cannot sustain another phase of escalation. Foreign reserves, already depleted by sanctions and currency collapse, are running on accounting fictions that cannot survive serious external pressure. The bread subsidy program that prevented urban unrest during the last protest cycle is funded by oil revenue that is increasingly difficult to monetize given the maritime interdiction architecture that the Americans have constructed. Every additional escalation step accelerates the timeline toward the moment when the regime cannot pay its own internal stabilization costs. The Saudis face their own complications. The decision to host Ukrainian specialists was made by a small circle, but the operational consequences will be visible to a much wider audience. Religious authorities within the kingdom have not been briefed on the deployment and will discover it through indirect channels in the coming days. The reaction within those circles, particularly given the kingdom's careful diplomatic positioning toward Russia over the past 2 years, is not predictable. Mohammed bin Salman has consolidated enough power to override clerical objections, but doing so consumes political capital that he has been husbanding for other purposes. In Washington, the administration is now confronting a situation it neither created nor fully controls. The Ukrainian deployment was facilitated by American intelligence coordination, but the decision to invite the Ukrainians was Saudi. The Americans now face a dilemma. Endorsing the deployment publicly accelerates Iranian retaliation timelines and risks the kind of regional escalation that the administration has spent 9 months avoiding. Distancing from the deployment publicly damages the credibility that American security guarantees rely on and signals to other Gulf partners that Washington will not back their independent security decisions. The path between these alternatives is narrowing by the hour. The Russians have been blindsided. Moscow's intelligence apparatus in the Gulf, degraded but not eliminated, did not detect the Ukrainian deployment until after it had been completed. The internal recriminations have already begun within the GRU and the SVR over how a development of this magnitude was missed. The strategic implications for Russian positioning in the broader region are devastating. The unspoken assumption that underwrote Russian Middle East policy that Gulf states would continue hedging because Russian power retained residual relevance has been falsified in a way that cannot be reversed. The Russians cannot eject the Ukrainians from Saudi territory. They cannot punish the Saudis without losing the remaining Gulf relationships they retain. They can only watch and adjust and recalculate the long-term trajectory of their regional standing. The Chinese, who have invested enormous diplomatic capital in positioning themselves as the indispensable mediator between Saudi Arabia and Iran, now face the collapse of the framework that gave that mediation meaning. The Beijing-brokered Saudi-Iranian normalization was always more theatrical than substantive, but it generated real diplomatic returns for Chinese standing. The Ukrainian deployment in Saudi territory signals that Riyadh has decided that Chinese mediation is insufficient and that direct Saudi capability development against Iranian threats is now the operative framework. Beijing's response is being calibrated currently, but the options available to it are constrained. Confronting Riyadh damages the energy supply relationship. Accommodating Riyadh validates the new strategic configuration that excludes Chinese centrality. The most dangerous variable in this configuration is the one that has not been identified by any of the major actors yet, and it is the variable that historically produces the largest strategic surprises. The variable is what the smaller Gulf actors will now do, having watched Riyadh make its decision. Abu Dhabi has its own relationship with Kyiv, predating the Saudi initiative by several months. Doha has its own concerns about Iranian capability and its own channels to Ukrainian intelligence. Manama hosts the American Fifth Fleet and has its own existential reasons to want the Iranian drone threat neutralized. If any of these capitals decide to follow the Saudi precedent independently, the Ukrainian footprint in the Gulf expands geometrically, and the entire regional security architecture shifts beyond any single actor's capacity to manage. The countdown clock that defines the next phase of this crisis is not measured in months. It is measured in weeks. The Ukrainian electronic warfare framework requires approximately 3 weeks to achieve full operational integration with Saudi air defense networks. During those 3 weeks, the framework is partially operational, partially exposed, and maximally vulnerable to the kind of preemptive strike that an Iranian command facing strategic catastrophe might consider rational. The IRGC commanders who built the drone strategy understand that the window to act before Ukrainian integration completes is narrow and closing rapidly. In Tehran, in rooms where the men responsible for the Islamic Republic's strategic posture are confronting a configuration that did not exist 72 hours ago, the calculation that has now become unavoidable is whether to accept a permanent and irreversible reduction in Iranian regional leverage, or to gamble on a high-risk preemptive action whose success depends on assumptions about Saudi air defense readiness that cannot be confirmed. The men making this calculation are not unified. They do not trust each other. They have spent the last 18 months conducting an institutional civil war that has not yet erupted into open conflict, but has eroded every coordination mechanism that previous crises depended upon. The decision that emerges from this fractured apparatus will not be optimal. It will be a compromise between factions that distrust each other, made under time pressure that none of them can manage, against a configuration of forces that none of them fully understand. The Strait of Hormuz crisis has not resolved. It has transformed. The actors who thought they were directing it are now reacting to it. The leverage that defined the previous 9 months has been redistributed by a deployment that was completed before most of the relevant capitals understood it had begun. And in the small windows of political space that remain, in the decision-making rooms that have not yet been briefed on the full scope of what has changed, the men who will make the next decisions are operating on intelligence assessments that have already been overtaken by events. What happens in the next 3 weeks will determine whether this transformation produces a stabilized new equilibrium or an escalation cascade that pulls in actors far beyond the immediate region. The Ukrainian specialists will continue their integration work. The Iranian command will continue its internal debate. The Saudis will continue calibrating their next moves. Washington will continue threading its needle. And the rest of the world will continue watching a crisis whose architecture has been quietly rebuilt by a country 2,500 miles away that was never supposed to be in the room. The clock is now running on a configuration that no analyst predicted and no capital has yet absorbed. The next move belongs to whoever decides first that hesitation is more dangerous than action. And in the space between the decisions that have already been made and the decisions that have not yet been forced, the most consequential transformation of the Persian Gulf strategic architecture in a generation is unfolding without a single official acknowledgement of what has actually changed.